Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Random Review. My name is Mike Hansen, and I am a reference librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, as well as co-coordinator of Random Review with my fellow librarian, Bonnie Brzezowski. Today for Random Review, Bruce Thomson and Charlie Fautin will review The Premonition, a Pandemic Story by Michael Lewis. And if you missed any of the previous reviews, you can find them on the Random Review webpage on the library's website. On the Random Review webpage, you can also sign up for next month's review, where Renee Brooks will review Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest by Susan Simard. Before we start today's review, I would like to acknowledge the Friends of the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library, who are co-sponsors of the Random Review series and have been instrumental in running Random Review for the past 30 years. They make programs like this and many other programs possible. Thank you, friends, for all you do. And a reminder for today's program that we will have time for questions at the end. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box that should be visible on your screen, and we will do our best to answer them as time allows at the end. And now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about today's reviewers. Dr. Bruce Thomson graduated from OSU with a master's in environmental ecology in 1975. After 10 years of research at the Hatfield Marine Science Center, he entered OHSU School of Medicine. Following completion of residency training in family medicine in 1993, he and his family returned to Corvallis. In 1998, he added Benton County Health Officer to his responsibilities. He has served through several outbreaks of communicable diseases within Benton County over the years. Many of those have been with Charlie Fautin, his trusted colleague and public health administrator. The SARS-CoV-2 COVID pandemic was a challenging end of his service as county health officer. Dr. Thomson maintains that the best thing that came out of this pandemic was how all aspects of our community worked as a team to minimize contagion and to maximize treatment for those that unfortunately became infected. Charlie Fautin, prior to his retirement, Charlie was Deputy Director of Benton County Health Department, administering public and environmental health programs and managing the Communicable Disease Control Program. Prior to moving to Corvallis, he worked as a nurse administrator on international refugee relief programs and for a Native Health Corporation in Alaska. I'd like to welcome both Charlie and Bruce to Random Review. Thank you for being here, guys.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction, and welcome all of you who are on this program today, spending your noon hour with us. I would like to thank Dr. Grube for volunteering me for this project. It's been I guess I would say not particularly a joy to review all of that went on with the pandemic, but I'm very pleased to have Charlie here so that we can share our reflections on this book. So the author of The Premonition, Michael Lewis, has written a number of very popular nonfiction accounts of radical and even revolutionary innovations in various aspects of American society and business, including the book Moneyball, about using statistics to change professional sports, The Big Short, to describe the origins of the 2008 financial crisis, and just before this book, wrote The Fifth Risk, which was about the inevitability and lack of attention to looming disasters. Michael Lewis's books are about systems and organizations. His books draw the reader in by introducing emblematic actual characters that were deeply involved and reflect the problems and innovations that he sees as a fundamental to the core of the story that he is telling. The Premonition was published in May of 2021, just 17 months into the COVID pandemic. It's worth noting that it isn't until chapter 7 that the original COVID outbreak in Wuhan, China begins in this book. Michael Lewis uses the activities and perceptions of the characters to illustrate the fact that a segment of Americans in both the private and public sectors recognized how dysfunctional Americans' public health system had become, and how this dysfunction caused the country to be almost totally unprepared for an inevitable global respiratory virus pandemic. In the book's introduction, the author sets the stage for where the pandemic was at the time of the publications at the start of 2021. In quoting from the book's introduction, Michael Lewis wrote, "Back in October 2019, nearly 3 years into the Trump administration, and before anyone involved was aware of the novel coronavirus, a collection of very smart people had gathered to rank all the countries of the world in order of their readiness for a pandemic. A group called the Nuclear Threat Initiative partnered with Johns Hopkins and the Economist Intelligence Unit to create what amounted to a preseason college football ranking for 195 countries. The Global Health Security Index, as it was called, was a massive undertaking involving millions of dollars and hundreds of researchers. They created stats and polled the experts. They ranked the United States first, number 1. The United Kingdom was ranked number 2. Unfortunately, that ends the quote from the introduction, and our reflection is, unfortunately, as it turned out, the ranking of the U.S. as number 1 in preparedness was all wrong. The United States, with a bit more than 4% of the world's population, had a bit more than 20% of global COVID-19 deaths. This has remained unchanged since the book's publication. Even now, the U.S. is still recording over 17% of the world's daily COVID deaths. This is equivalent to 300 to 500 deaths in America for the past year. The early chapters of the book highlight the creation of the first national pandemic response plan in 2005, and this was the result of a mandate from President George W. Bush, who, after experiencing both Hurricane Katrina and September 11th attacks, read a book called The Great Influenza by John Barry. And Charlie has composed a list of books related to this subject, and you will be able to see about that book, The Great Influenza by John Barry. President Bush actually read the book, and he was stunned to learn that after almost a century, the U.S. had no national pandemic preparedness plan. In author interviews that we have read, Michael Lewis says that initially he thought this book would focus on errors made by the Trump administration, and that President Trump's performance would be a major part of the book. But as soon as he started his research, he developed a different thesis. Trump was just a comorbidity. He realized that the fundamental problems were and are systemic and date back decades. Lewis highlights the deep dysfunction throughout the American system of public health, as well as the dysfunction within Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which at one time was considered a crown jewel of American government. The book focuses on those who think about, plan for, and determine how to mitigate a pandemic, and how in most cases they are like Cassandra, continually giving warnings and telling the truth, but never being listened to or heeded. While the topics and tone of the book are complex and heavy, the science, policy, and politics are focused on the engaging characters, and the writing style is more akin to a fast-moving novel than historical narrative. This book is a page-turner with 320 of very engaging pages, well-spaced, well-told, much like his other books. As these reviewers read and discussed this book, a number of the stories and concepts that the author was illustrating resonated deeply with our local experience in Benton County and around the state. And this was particularly true during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. That concludes this introduction to the book, the author, and for here, I will turn it over to Charlie, and I'll be back in a little bit to give you more information.
Thanks for the introduction, Bruce. So we're going to go through the book a little bit piece by piece. I don't think there's any spoilers here. We all know that there's a global respiratory disease pandemic going on, and that many people foresaw this and were working on preparedness ahead of time. The book really, as Bruce said, goes into a lot of detail about a lot of the background work and a lot of the things that people did foresee, and some of the frustrations that those people had, and some of the accomplishments that they had. Starting with the prologue of the book. The prologue is called The Looking Glass, and it's a bit of a play on words. The chapter, the prologue covers primarily two people, a father and daughter named Bob and Laura Glass, hence the title, The Looking Glass. Bob Glass worked at Sandia National Laboratories. His daughter, Laura, was a high school student, and for her science project, she was wanting to model and work on communicable disease outbreaks. And her father was a computer expert, so she got his help to develop some basic computer models to simulate disease outbreaks. She gradually, through the years of working on science projects, improved these models by studying the behaviors, actually, of her community and her high school student cohort. Working together, the two of them developed these models. And then as the pandemic began, through connections that the father, Bob Glass, had to other national experts, he was able to get the attention on their model to two of the people who are introduced later in the book, Carter Mesher and Richard Hackett, who were working on computer pandemic preparedness. Bruce.
So moving on to chapters 1 and 2, the chapters 1 and 2 introduce Charity Dean. Charity is an extraordinary person, a physician who served as the local public health officer for Santa Barbara County, California. Charity Dean was born in Junction City, Oregon, and grew up under what most people would call very challenging conditions. She had a ritual of every year on her birthday at the end of December, writing down resolutions and observations of the previous year, as well as her thoughts for the upcoming year. At the end of December 2019, based on her sense of what she was reading and seeing in Wuhan, she added the words to her list of resolutions, "It has begun," referring to her acknowledgement that a new global pandemic had begun. That was even before the infectious agent had been identified. Charity graduated from OSU in 2000 with a BS in Bachelor of Science in microbiology. She then went on to Tulane University in Louisiana to earn a Master's of Public Health as well as her medical degree in tropical medicine. Truly an extraordinary person. Dr. Dean did her internship and medical residency in Santa Barbara and became the local county health officer in 2018. Within 18 months, the pandemic had started in the US. Within a year, she was appointed as the Deputy Public Health Director of the state of California. Because of her aggressive scientific approach to dealing with the challenges of the new and evolving pandemic. As you may have seen this week in this week's GT, this year, Charity Dean will give the commencement address at OSU. Mute, Charlie.
Oh, sorry. Chapters 3 and 4 move on to pandemic preparedness. They're titled Pandemic Thinkers and Stopping the Unstoppable. And here we're introduced to two brilliant thinkers, Carter Mesher and Richard Hatchett, who I referred to before of getting the computer model from Bob and Laura Glass. They were part of a team that President George W. Bush had assembled to put together the National Pandemic Preparedness Plan that he had noted the gap. Mesher and Hatchett spent a lot of their time reanalyzing health data and looking at news stories from the 1918 flu pandemic, trying to learn as much as possible about what had happened during the great influenza and what lessons might have been missed or misinterpreted during that. They also used Laura and Bob Glass's computer model and the assistance of a couple of other really brilliant computer wonks to develop very powerful computer programs to model contagious diseases. And all of this analysis revealed previously overlooked insights and lessons about what worked and what didn't work to delay, mitigate, and disrupt local flu pandemics in the vaccine age. So I'm going to put up a slide here. This slide illustrates a couple of cities in the United States and what happened there. The teal colored spike on the left is the city of Philadelphia. What happened in Philadelphia was the flu took hold in the city. The people governing the health department and the city government knew a lot of people were sick, but there was a huge war bond rally planned and no one wanted to disrupt that. Hence, there were parades and music and the gathering of tens of thousands of people. And as a result, by the time only a few days later that they put in closure orders for businesses, schools, bars, restaurants, churches, things like that, it was too late. The virus was already established. And as you can see, the incidence of disease spiked up very, very quickly, very high, sickened and killed a lot of people. The maroon color on the right, by contrast, is the city of St. Louis. And what happened there is the city recognized the onset of flu and acted very quickly and did the same social closure orders that were done in Philadelphia, only they did them without delay. And as a result, their pandemic curve looks quite different. And this is exactly what our elected officials and our public health experts were after in early 2020, and was what was called softening the curve. The importance of this and the lesson that Mesher and Hatchett took from this was that at the start of every pandemic, even in these days of biomedical progress, at the beginning of a pandemic caused by an emerging novel virus, there will be no vaccines, and the world might as well be back in 1918. But they also learned from reading news reports that in 1918, there was public pushback on those social distancing and the suspension of business and social activities. So the lesson to them was that those measures needed to be implemented at just the right time. And because the public had little tolerance for those kind of measures lasting more than 4 to 6 weeks. So another thing that we were able to uncover doing local pandemic preparedness, Dr. Thomson and myself looked through local records, and we found this resolution from the city of Corvallis, the city council, that issued social closure orders on October 8, 1918. As you can see, they closed public places of amusement, entertainment, theaters, moving picture theaters, churches, Sunday schools, pool halls, billiard halls, card rooms, many other places. It's an interesting document to look at. Corvallis and Oregon had fairly low relative rates of flu death in 1918, and early action like this may have been a part of that. Bruce.
All right, thank you, Charlie, for that historical perspective. So in chapter 6, another important character in the telling of the premonition was Joe DeRisi. So Joe DeRisi was a brilliant biochemist and genomic innovator who developed innovative techniques for identifying infectious organisms through rapid genetic analysis. Joe DeRisi was a graduate student researcher with a newly awarded PhD at UCSF. Unusually, the faculty granted him extraordinary license, and rather than doing the usual required postdoctoral years of 1 to 2 years of additional research, they actually gave him his own lab because, in quoting from the book, they did not want to waste a moment of his mind. He went on to develop technology and instruments to analyze viral genomes that, as he explained it in the Premonition, quote, what cost $10,000 and weeks to do in 2001 now costs a penny, and it's done within 24 hours. Starting slowly at the beginning of the pandemic, phone calls were coming into DeRisi's lab. Before long, his lab phone became known as the Red Phone. Charlie?
Yes, we'll move on now and talk a little about the antagonists of the book and some of the revelations and criticisms that Michael Lewis brings up. And first one runs through the book is a criticism of the American public health system. I think it's fair to say that most Americans, if you went out on the street and asked them, would believe that this is a highly organized system. The CDC is somehow in charge of a pyramid of city, county, state, and tribal public health agencies that coordinate and work together in a network to do surveillance, detection, and response of communicable disease. And our experience is that's definitely not the case. And there's a quote in the book from Dr. Charity Dean. It says, quote, the US does not have a public health system. It has 5,000 dots, and each of those dots serves at the will of an elected official, unquote. The author Michael Lewis uses Dr. Dean as a model health officer and describes various challenges she faced throughout her career to help explain the authorities and powers of a health officer's role. And while those explanations hold for this book and for Dr. Dean's jurisdictions in California, we think it's important to expand in a way that the author does not, that the laws of each state vary widely. And the explanations that are given in this book about the state of California and Dr. Dean's authority don't necessarily or don't at all hold nationwide. The laws and authorities of each state vary significantly and often very, very widely from those of their neighboring states. There are also differences between public health departments within a state. And in fact, here in Oregon, there are a few counties that have chosen not even to have their own public health departments. Elected officials of each state, county, city, and tribe may and often do offer different opportunities and, most importantly, impose different limitations on each health department and each health officers, since they serve at the will of those elected officials. Another theme and criticism that run through the book is of the Centers of Disease Control, the CDC specifically. The book clearly and accurately describes many of the problems and shortfalls that plague the CDC. One is explained in a quote from the book. The CDC publishes learned papers on health crises after the fact. It manages very carefully public perceptions of itself, but when the shooting starts, it leaps into the nearest foxhole while others take the fire, unquote. Many people advocating for reform and rehabilitation of the CDC trace the root of its spiral to the Reagan administration. Prior to that time, CDC directors were part of the civil service system and typically came up through the ranks and developed their skills while doing major global investigations of things like smallpox, polio, measles, diphtheria. And directors typically served 6 to 12 years so the agency had stable policies and administration. But starting with President Reagan, the CDC director was made a presidential appointee and selected in part for their political affiliation. They also then are now almost always selected from either medical practice or academic medicine rather than public health itself. And now the typical duration of a CDC director is 3 to 4 years. And just as an aside, we can see this history being repeated right now, or in the past administration, at least, with attacks on Dr. Anthony Fauci and the National Institutes of Health. All of the National Institutes of Health, all the personnel there are members of the civil service system. And that is a huge reason why neither Dr. Fauci nor the NIH could be dismissed or silenced by the Trump administration. And the President Trump, as a candidate, has indicated that the civil service system is one of his targets should he be reelected. Bruce.
One other aspect that we wanted to bring out regarding the antagonists was the whole feature of the misinformation, mistrust of science, and the role of social media regarding misinformation and mistrust of science. We don't want to get into that too deeply, but certainly wanted to highlight that as an antagonism to our protagonists. From the perspective of public health and public policy, the Premonition brings out 3 important messages. The first one is that science and history substantiates that pandemics are inevitable. There will be more. One of the points made by several characters and emphasized by the author at numerous points throughout the book is that the pandemic illness outbreaks are nothing new. And Charlie has put up a slide here just documenting the history of pandemics across time, dating back to quite a long time ago. And what we do know is that from as early as March of 2023, there have been over 6.8 million COVID deaths recorded worldwide. And the US has a disproportional share of those deaths. Charlie, could we go back to, yes, thank you. So that was the purpose of that slide, just to emphasize that this important public health, public policy message about future pandemics. Charlie, you're up.
So another lesson in the book that Michael Lewis emphasizes is that pandemics start small, but become very big very quickly. He uses a couple of analogies in the book to illustrate this. And so here's a quote from the book that he uses at one point for this illustration. Quote, "If you took a penny and doubled it every day for 30 days, you'd have more than $5 million. So here's a graph that indicates, we've all heard about exponential growth, and this indicates the difference between linear growth and exponential growth. Another example that Michael Lewis uses is, quote, "Take a piece of paper and fold it in half, then fold it in half again, and fold it in half for a total of 50 times. If a piece of paper is 0.004 inches thick to begin with, by the time you fold it 50 times, it is more than 70 million miles thick." So that's the illustration of exponential growth. Exponential growth is stated a different way by Dr. Dean. In the book, she's quoted as giving a briefing to California Governor Newsom's staff at the very beginning of the pandemic. Quote, "In the beginning, you have only one death, and really, it seems like not such a big deal. But once you realize that only half of 1% of the people who get the disease die, you can surmise that for every death, there were 199 other people walking around sick in California a month earlier. The best assumption was that each person who got the virus was infecting 2 to 3 others. Do the math for the California population with zero immunity, and 7 weeks later, you'd have 11,809,000 cases. More than 1 million Californians would need a hospital bed. Half of 1%, or a bit more than 59,000 people, would have died. All that can be surmised from the report of the first death," unquote. So this slide illustrates something that people have probably heard about: the infectivity and transmissibility of infectious pathogens is expressed as a number of unvaccinated or otherwise non-immune people that each infected people will be expected to infect. And it's called the R0. And this graph illustrates a few things about SARS-CoV. So on the left, we have the average seasonal flu. So each person who's infected infects 1.2 other people, and any R0 greater than 1 means that the infection is spreading. The second one is 2009 swine flu. The third one, with an R0 of 2.8, is the original Wuhan wild type COVID. Then the Alpha variant, the Delta variant, chickenpox, which is a very, very infectious disease, has an R naught of 8.5, and measles, which throughout our careers was thought of as the most infectious virus known to man, has an R naught of 15. But we can see on the far right that the Omicron variant, which is the most recent variant that is circulating in the world, has surpassed that with an R naught of over 16. So an incredibly infectious organism. Bruce.
The third point that is illustrated in the book by the book that we wanted to underscore was the important public health message that is talked about in Chapter 8, a chapter called Man Gulch. Pandemics are much like wildfires. Action needs to be taken early, and there will be blowups. In Chapter 8, the author introduces the 1992 book, and this will be on the reading list that Charlie will supply, the book called Young Men and Fire by Norman MacLean, which is about a tremendously large wildfire in Montana in 1949. It was during this wildfire that for the first time, it was recognized that once a fire got started, it created its own unique weather system, which supported the fire to grow even larger. In public health, this is analogous to the concept of, the fact of exponential growth of viruses. The quote from Man Gulch in the Premonition: "It is easy for us to assume that as a result of modern science, we have conquered nature. But we should be prepared for the possibility that even if we are going to accompany modern firefighters into Man Gulch, that the terror of the universe has not yet fossilized and the universe has not run out of blowups." Now, as time would allow, we'd like to move on before we take questions. So we wanted to spend some time talking about successes, mistakes, and other discussion points. One big discussion point was school closures. And we have to admit that there was a mistake made there. And the source of that mistake was Carter Meacher had calculated that while there were 70,000 buses involved with public transport all across the nation, there were 500,000 buses involved with transporting K through 12 school kids. So from an analysis that Carter did of previous influenza outbreaks, Carter determined that closing schools and social distancing of children decreased the transmission by 60%. Well, unfortunately, that was what was true for influenza virus turned out not to be true for SARS-CoV-2. It was learned more than half a year into closing schools that the majority of school-aged children lacked the receptors in their nasal passages to which the COVID virus had to attach and thereby enter the body. Given the fact that, in spite of this, given the fact that the majority of Americans employed by state and local governments were employed in education, schools and colleges remained closed until after the development of vaccines to protect the adults. Teachers and staff, adults over the age of 65, along with medical providers and caregivers, were prioritized in Oregon to receive the first shipments of vaccine. With vaccines, schools were allowed to reopen with a new set of protocols. Another discussion point was that the pandemic highlighted inequities in our national healthcare system with regard to what was possible with adequate resources. Even before vaccines were available, protocols were developed and followed strictly by a motivated group of individuals in our community and other communities. This was the experience of Division I sports. In Oregon and other Pac-12 states, working with the NCAA and CDC, developed stringent protocols that were strictly enforced. Motivated group. As a result of strict adherence to these stringent protocols, OSU football was the only team in the Pac-12 that did not have to forfeit a game due to an infected team or staff member. An interesting shout out to our OSU partners. Thirdly, we wanted to talk about how the community pulled together. Corvallis was a model of community effort with willing implementation of social distancing and masking. Donations of PPE from OSU, local dentists, veterinarians, and others prevented Samaritan hospitals from suffering the shortages that occurred in other statewide jurisdictions. Our three counties, Lynn, Benton, and Lincoln, along with OSU, LBCC, Samaritan Health, and all other medical clinics, school districts, cities, and others collaborated well. Our public health supported weekly meetings with our tri-county medical providers where changing protocols were discussed and clarified and ongoing needs were assessed and addressed. Through this support structure, knowledge and resources were shared throughout our three county-wide hospital system.
So wrapping this up, looking at the end of the book, I think once again, as mentioned at the start, it's worth noting that the book was written during the first year of the pandemic and was published just immediately after the Biden administration had been inaugurated and had supercharged distribution and administration of mRNA vaccines. The book seemed to us to end rather abruptly, and it seems plausible that the author and publisher may have felt a little urgency, felt with the vaccine coming out, the pandemic was near its end, and wanted to get this book out, be on the front wave of the pandemic literature that was in the works. That's just conjecture on our part, but the book does drop off sort of quickly at the end. And without, despite the title of the book and a lot of the book being about foresight, there's nothing really at the end of the book that looks forward in the pandemic itself. Some of the end of the book turns back to Dr. Charity Dean. And at the end of the book, she actually leaves the public sector, leaves the state of California and her job as deputy public health director there. And she forms a for-profit organization that she calls, to us sort of oxymoronically, but she calls the Public Health Company. And it's aimed at providing prevention services for corporations and governments who are willing and able to pay to protect their interests and profits. It's worth noting that a lot of Michael Lewis's books are about American businesses and how outside the box thinkers have changed profit-making systems from Wall Street banking to Major League Sports and others. And it sort of seems like he takes this approach with this book too, and that this is a bit of his image for reforming public health. But in a way, to us, this seems a bit counterintuitive, since most of the book focuses on characters who have spent their entire careers dedicated to government service for very inadequate salaries, They've been very successful and dedicated to the cause of reducing human illness and death, not for the highest bidder, but for the population as a whole. But that's just our feeling. And for all that, I want to reiterate Bruce's observations at the start that we feel this book is not only entertaining, but very edifying. It does a very good job of illustrating the dysfunction of the American public health system. I'm going to put up, while Michael looks at the questions and begins the Q&A, I'll put up a slide with some of the reading that we've pulled out that we feel would partner with this book. So Mike.
Thank you, Charlie and Bruce. That was very interesting. I really appreciate your local perspectives on it too. It's has a lot of value to that. We do have some questions here. I'll start with one that was wondering about the school shutdowns, school closures, and the question is regarding some states that are forbidding school closures and masking and vaccine mandates, and just kind of how that would maybe play into the overall policies in place for pandemic. Obviously, we did have closures, and it seems successful in some ways for us. But if you have any comments on that, I suppose.
Well, I'll start, I guess. So every pandemic is a different organism and has different properties and qualities that cause it to grow so exponentially within a population. Hard to say if the next pandemic will spare children going to school. We won't know that until several weeks or perhaps months into a pandemic where children actually are susceptible, much like the influenza pandemics. We have, during this pandemic, there were examples of states that took different approaches from what Oregon took as far as public health goes. And in the Southern Conference of football teams, many teams were not able to play because of the infection rate in their teams. This question really highlights the point that Charlie was making about how we don't really have a good public health system in this country. We are not number one,
I think
internationally.
I would just say it seems foolish to take tools out of any toolbox before the fact. The tools need to be used judiciously, but to take any tools away seems imprudent.
All right, thank you. So I guess some of the questions are also, I guess, speaking to you in the positions that you held, although I kind of am happy to focus mostly on the book. This is not necessarily an interview of you guys. This is a discussion of this book. So we can kind of translate it to referring to the book in some ways, I think, but your local knowledge is valuable and important in understanding and applying it to our experiences as well. But I guess there was a question about what kind of lessons ultimately have we learned, I think, from this? Is there some things that Michael Lewis says, or maybe some things that you guys even maybe can point out?
Yeah, I think that some of the lessons in the book are that there are brilliant people who are thinking about and planning for these things. the plans were made, the plans were in place. They were based on influenza. That was an assumption that the United States and the globe made, that the next great pandemic would be an influenza virus. And as a result, the behavior of the coronavirus that emerged was quite different. Nevertheless, we were able to pivot rather quickly. People were able to use that data rapidly. And I think the important piece of the book was how little use was made of the actual on-the-ground adaptation of the plan that the planners and the thinkers and the modelers were able to make very, very quickly. We were really fortunate to be able to get the genotype of this coronavirus out within days of its emergence using the technology we've got. And yet the systems were not nimble enough to respond to that and to adapt to that as quickly as the science and the people recommending policy wanted to move.
Great. One question that's here that I actually had too was, what is the connection between NIH and CDC? You referenced them both at one point.
So this is one of the inefficiencies of our system. They are parallel, non-linked government entities that each have their own silos and mandates and roles. Often we're dependent on both. So things like vaccines and the drugs that are used against COVID and everything else, the National Institutes of Health are in charge of reviewing safety and efficacy and allowing licensure and use and sale and mandating and dictating the recommendations for physicians to utilize those drugs in the US. The CDC then puts out recommendations for their use and how they are to be applied in real life. One problem with that is that, again, as I indicated before, those CDC recommendations are just that, the recommendations. They don't have the power of authority for states. And with almost all of these things, each state is adapting and modifying those recommendations. They can't go beyond the NIH licensure, but they can adapt and modify and morph the CDC recommendations within their science and their political world. That has the advantage of allowing each state and each jurisdiction to respond to its local demographics, its local population, its local politics, but it has the drawback of eliminating standardization. What happens in one county may be quite different from what happens right across the street, right across the river in a neighboring county. So it's a complex, and as the book indicates quite well, a not well coordinated system. I hesitate to even use the word system.
Right, thank you. So you mentioned that Benton County did well. And as far as we were, I think you said model citizens or model community in some ways about responsiveness and cooperative work. Do we have any statistics as far as comparing us to other communities? I know that there have been from Oregon. I guess we were just kind of curious about how the death statistics compared in some ways. Can we give ourselves a good pat on the back that we did a lot better than everyone else?
Well, Oregon was total deaths nationally. Oregon of all states is number 8 with the fewest deaths. And the states with the most deaths from COVID-19 had twice as many deaths as the states who had the fewest in that top 8 with the fewest deaths. So that's nationally how the state did. As far as Benton County goes, throughout the majority of the pandemic, the variability within counties, among counties, as far as deaths were concerned, and these are calculated on deaths per 100,000 or per 10,000 in some cases. The Benton County was at the not the very top, but certainly at the top of the list of the fewest deaths per capita, fewest deaths per capita.
I will add that, so we probably got a bunch of people on here who were watching the statistics pretty closely throughout the pandemic. We have a lot of people with biostatistics and statistical backgrounds who spend a lot of time looking at that data and on the phone with us asking about it. I will say there was a lot of time, particularly during the first 2 years of the pandemic, when Benton County had among the highest per capita positive infection rates. But a lot of that was due to surveillance. We had a lot of testing going on here. OSU was doing a lot of active testing on campus. They had the ongoing, I'm blocking on the name of their project right now, Bruce, where they were doing random testing. They're also doing community-wide testing, but our medical system and our private sector partners, particularly Willamette Valley Toxicology, was making testing extremely rapid, extremely available. And so there was a bit of a statistical anomaly there between Benton County and places that were not doing quite as much testing. But the death rates, as Bruce says, are quite well standardized and a good indication of a good comparator statewide.
Thank you. Maybe time for one more brief question. Someone asked, why did it take so long to recognize the airborne transmission and super spreader events? What was preventing us from nationally recognizing that initially?
Boy, that is a really good question. The aerosol physicists who work on this stuff primarily in industrial areas, but also with all sorts of pathogens, were screaming this from the rooftops early on. The fact that CDC and even World Health Organization were so reluctant, stuck to the droplet spread model for so long, in my opinion, is completely political. And I'm not quite sure what was behind that, except that it made precautions. It was in line with the early recommendations, things like 6 feet which of course has no relevance to something airborne, is only relevant if something is sticking to large droplets that drop out of the air. And I think there was probably some political reluctance to indicate that the spread was much easier. I'm not sure what was behind it. I'm pretty sure it was predominantly political.
Yeah, it certainly seemed, Charlie, thanks for those details, because it does get a little fuzzy there. So it seemed like it was fairly early on, the recognition of super spreader events, but how that got translated in this country into, maintaining the droplet thesis versus the airborne thesis was what you were, I think, discussing, part related to what you were discussing, Charlie.
Great, thank you. And that is about time for us. So I want to thank you both so much for being here and reviewing the book. I really appreciate it. I also wanted to briefly thank you both for your service to your community. We all appreciate that. Your years of hard work and service to us. Thanks again. And thanks for joining us, everyone. And we will see you again next time. Have a good day. Thank you.